3 basic ways of introducing elements in your tracks. Small changes in the arrangements can make quite a big difference. 2 main ways of adding variation for just a single element. Hi, my name is Boris, and in today's video I'm going to give you 10 tips to help you with arranging your loops into full tracks. First, let's listen to the track we're going to be using as an example. We will talk about how to learn how tracks are arranged in your genre, how to get started with arranging if you feel stuck with a loop, and how to add interest and movement throughout the track. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, if you like what you see in this tutorial, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We are making all kinds of music production tutorials in Ableton Live like this one. And if you'd like to learn arrangements a little bit more in depth, check out our arrangement course, in which we teach you all the techniques you need to turn boring loops into professional sounding full tracks. Alright, so let's get started with our 10 tips. Tip number 1, study the arrangements of tracks. You can import a reference track into Ableton Live and mark different sections with place markers. This is how you learn which sections are typically in use in your genre. And for example, I have exported this track, and if I make a brand new project and I drop the track right here, it shows up as an audio file. Now our track is loading slowly. Make sure it's warped. A very cool technique is, for example, you could slice the track into different sections. That's just visually what I would do at the beginning if you're doing like a very basic analysis, so like intro. So here would be a drop 1, now break, drop 2, also a break, and then there's another drop 3 and then an outro. That's one technique of going about it. Tip number 2 would be creating outlines of arrangements. If you'd like to study other arrangements a little bit more in depth, you can easily create outlines of what's inside by creating empty MIDI clips. And this way you can easily learn how different elements evolve over time. But this requires very attentive, repeated listening. So for example, you can add a bunch of MIDI tracks. You can just add new clips in the sections. And for example, in this section, there's probably just drums. And then maybe here some synth starts playing. So for example, an ARP or something. Okay, maybe that's a different scenario. We have a bass playing here, and maybe there are some additional perks that come in here, but you get the idea. Basically, you want to analyze the entire track and try to imagine what the layout is here and how many actually elements are playing in each section. And I've done that with this track, and let me go back to the project file. So I have this group right here under the entire project file where I have mapped all the sections. So for example, here I also added some names onto the different clips. So for example, this is high pass, a few elements. Here's some percussion elements pop in. And here we have an additional bass pattern. And that's basically it. Just color differently the synths from the drums or the basic stuff. So these could be synths, leads. Coloring is up to you, but in this way you kind of get the idea of how tracks are arranged, how different elements evolve in tracks in your genre. If you do this a couple of times, you will get a very good idea of how this is done, because this is quite difficult to grasp all at once when you just hear a track. But when you visualize stuff in this way, you start to notice certain patterns. For example, that there's often a break happening, how long it is, or what kind of elements are usually have the most impact in the drop, or what kind of techniques are used to add variation. All of that can be nicely discovered by using this technique. Tip number 3, before starting to arrange, move your initial loop forward. For example, to bar 101, try to estimate where the drop would be in your track and try to work your way into it rather than just copying the loop over a lot of times and just disabling or removing things. This technique usually gives you much more freedom to create the introduction to the track. For instance, here maybe our first drop would be this loop. So 16 bars here. Maybe I started producing from this, but only then I copied it to bar 85. And at that point, just working my way towards it, copying some elements from, for example, the noise, the bass, the kick, high passing some of it, and I'm creating the intro. Only then I am listening and adding some more and more elements, and then I end up at the drop. Tip number 4, arrange from the start of your track, rather than focusing on the drop or chorus section first. In this way you make sure the track progresses nicely. Also, for each track, the peak moment happens at a different point. So if you feel like you need a longer or shorter intro, make sure to move the main loop or the drop moment to a desired position even after initially placing it. So for example, I could have wrongly estimated that the drop is going to be somewhere here. I could have dropped it at bar 137. Actually, at this point when I listen, hey, I feel like I need the full impact, so I could place it right here. Or it could be done in any other way. You are never stuck with certain placement. Try to have the timing right. The timing is really important in your track. You don't want to bore your listener with an overly long introduction, but you don't really want to surprise your listener with a drop that is too abrupt and would basically not giving the listener enough anticipation to build up the momentum. Tip number 5, try to tell a story with your arrangement. One approach could be to start your track from the foundations. So for example, the drum elements. Basic drums are often a way of starting techno tracks. This is not a requirement, however. You are free to explore this. You could start your track with any element that you feel like would be a good beginning to the story that you're telling. The key is to make it natural, so you don't want to really make your listener confused. You want to slowly build up the interest in your track. And with dance music, that often means that the track needs to start from the drums, but could start from melodies, from pads, from any other harmonic element. The creative possibilities are pretty endless here, as long as the progression of the track feels natural. Tip number 6, the evolution of elements. That's probably the most important aspect of arranging in electronic music. So in typical techno and house tracks like this one, a common arrangement would start from introducing basic drums. For example, here we are playing the kick and bass and maybe some noise and claps here. So very basic sort of foundation elements here, and gradually introducing more drum parts and the bass line, only then adding some harmonic elements. Here it would be this second bass line and also this Moog LFO. Then we have a main lead, which also slowly appears. Continuing with the typical techno or house arrangement, after the first section where you build up everything, you showcase what you have initially in your track, you could have a break. For example, here in this section, maybe we could see that a bit more simplified in this view over here. So here we have a bit of a break here with the high pass kicks and bass. Here we have a full-on break and a build-up. And so the heaviest drum elements are dropped. We have a full high pass here. So just taming some of that energy and just going back, reflecting a little bit. And this is the moment where you can build up tension before the second drop or the second main section. And only then you bring back the drums and all the powerful elements. So the second section could be this one, so this drop. It could only have only a selection of the initial loop, and it could also add some more interesting elements. For example, here we only have this second melody playing, which is different from the first one. Then we are adding a background melody, and then we are adding also a background lead. And then bass as well. That's really cool. But as you can see, we are really playing around, not throwing all of the most powerful elements at the front of the drop, but rather placing them and just building up more and more elements as we go. And at some point, maybe you might need to drop some of the elements to not overcomplicate the structure of the track. And after that, there might come an outro. For example, here we have an outro where more and more tracks fade out. Ultimately, for example, leaving only the main drum elements so that the DJ can mix out of the track and into something else. Yeah, so pay attention to the evolution of elements in your reference tracks. Ask yourself, when do the elements appear and when do they drop out? And use your gathered insights as a reference point when arranging your own tracks. Ultimately, every track is different, so it's usually best to arrange according to what you think will fit, rather than copying existing arrangements. Tip number 7. Introducing different elements does not need to be abrupt. To make transitions smoother, you can use simple automations. 3 basic ways of introducing elements in your tracks are: number 1, gain automation. Some elements only might require the volume to be gradually increased. There are also cases where volume automation is used at the beginning and end of tracks. This can be easily done with Ableton's utility. You can just drop it right onto any track and automate it. For example, we would be adding an element here and then fading it out. So that leaves our track volume ready here. So when we feel like we need to boost the volume of the track without affecting the automation here, we can always do that. And if you automate this one, you will not be able to move the knob, because then you will disable your automation. So utility is perfect for this. Number 2, filter automation. That's a little bit more of an interesting way of introducing and fading out different sounds. So we can automate just a cutoff knob of, for example, the auto filter effect in Ableton. And typically that would be a low pass filter. Here we have a high pass. We could take any element really. And for example, here we can actually observe that the auto filter frequency is doing this. We are introducing the main lead here. As you can see here, the auto filter opens up and then it closes. And with gain and auto filter automations, you can already do quite a lot. But the third basic technique still is using reverb and delay. These techniques sound very interesting. Using reverb for transitions makes stuff washed out and makes it sound very distant. Using delay results in an echo, which can last quite a while after the element stops playing. You could use, of course, different types of reverb and different types of delay. There are so many options here. Tip number 8. If your track sounds repetitive and hypnotic, which is often the case with techno and house tracks, small changes in the arrangements can make quite a big difference. As the different sections, they do not really need to differ so much from each other in comparison, for example, to a pop track, which has a more standard verse-chorus division, and for example, a bridge section, which sounds totally different. In repetitive genres, usually bringing elements in and disabling elements in sections already gives you a lot of interest, because you typically listen to these tracks a bit more attentively. You focus on what the melodic and rhythmic elements are present. But still, to make these small changes, you need to be quite strategic and creative. There's no single way of adding variation, of course. Luckily, with all the tools you have in modern DAWs like Ableton, you can often do plenty of different things just with a single element. So if you have a single element and you're looking to add variation, we have tip number 9, which is about 2 main ways of adding variation for just a single element. And the first way would be with effects automation. So if you're making dance tracks, then often processing single tracks or groups with DJ style effects, so filters, reverbs, echoes, that can add a lot of cool movement. But the second technique would be MIDI editing. This could be a bit more demanding than just adding an effect and automating it. If you're working on, for example, this shaker loop, you could disable only one element of it, or you could disable strategic different elements and only then have it play, and then introduce some variety by adding new MIDI here. And this doesn't change the timbre, but adds rhythmic variety. And if you're looking to add variation to a melodic part, that's also could be challenging. And you also have some easy options here. For example, you could split your clips to play only sections in certain parts. For example, we have this Moog bending pattern. Here's what it sounds like. Instead of just having it play for so long, we could just take this section and sort of tease it, putting it in certain parts. So like this, you get the idea. You can take certain melodic parts and just throw them in certain strategic points to just have a bit of a teaser and split your clips in various creative ways. Another thing you could do is pitching around certain MIDI or audio samples. You could pitch stuff down by an octave, up by a fifth, or up by an octave, and then you could end up with a totally different vibe and feel. And basically, it's almost as if you had two drastically different elements. Of course, it's possible always to combine these different approaches using effects, automation, and using MIDI change and just going crazy with a single element. That's also possible. Okay, so tip number 10 would be don't get too hung up on details while arranging. It's usually best to keep introducing a little bit of variation throughout the entire track, but not too much. Try to keep the structure and transitions quite simple. If arrangement isn't easy for you, it's probably good to stick to this idea. Let's keep the listener just consistently engaged so that the track doesn't sound boring, because the transitions can always be spiced up after we do the initial arrangement of the track. So once the initial stage is done, you go throughout the track, you build up your different sections. That can already take quite a while, and this takes even longer with longer tracks, longer genres. You can bounce the track to audio, just have a break, refresh your ears, and just listen to it in a different setting after some tracks you like from your genre, or you could take it to a different setting, listen to it in your car, listen to it on a different system, on your phone even. And when you listen to it, just try to write down the things that stick out, that need to be fixed. Then you can go back into the studio and fix them. When you do that, you are not really looking at your DAW, at all the things that possibly could be added, because when you look at all the tracks, you see that you could potentially click on each one of these, and just every of these tracks just hides hundreds of knobs in it that could be tweaked at any time. And when you just listen to a track, you don't have that ability. You need to be focused on what's going on and what actually needs to be done, rather than what could be done. So the process of arranging could go infinitely. It can be quite a rabbit hole if you're very detail oriented, but try not to overproduce by adding too many effects and transitions. Keep in mind that the listener probably isn't going to be looking to listen to fancy effects, but to music. And humans typically like music that isn't overcomplicated. Okay, I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you'd like to learn arrangements a little bit more in depth, check out our arrangements course, in which we teach you all the techniques you need to arrange boring loops into professional sounding full tracks. If you'd like to explore Ableton Live more, we're running a music production academy with start to finish courses on making tracks in various genres, so make sure to check that out. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like, write us a comment, and I will see you in the next tutorials.
Hi, this video is sponsored by us. If you like these tutorials and want to support the channel, check out our website packed with online courses and professional sound packs. If you want to cut years of your learning curve, check the PML Beginner to Advanced Music Production program for Ableton Live. You will know Ableton inside out and learn how to write, produce, mix and master complete tracks. You learn step by step at your own speed, from an empty file to professional production, as if we're sitting side by side in the studio. Thank you for listening.